They wanted me broken, scattered like sand in the desert wind. My enemies thought exile would be my end, that stripping away my crown would strip away my spirit. But they underestimated the blood of the Ptolemies flowing through my veins. In the darkest hour of my life, when I had lost everything I held dear, I discovered that a queen without a throne is not powerless. She is dangerous. This is the story of how I, Cleopatra VII, turned my greatest defeat into my most magnificent rebirth. This is the story of how I learned that true power comes not from what you wear, but from what burns inside you.
My name is Cleopatra, seventh of my name, daughter of Ptolemy XII, Auletes, Pharaoh of Egypt, born of Greek and Macedonian blood in the great city of Alexandria. I speak to you now not as a legend carved in stone, but as a woman who has walked through fire and emerged transformed. The story I am about to tell you is one I have never shared in its entirety, a story of the darkest period of my life, when I was barely 21 years old, cast out from my own kingdom, hunted like prey through the unforgiving deserts of Egypt. You may know me as the woman who captivated Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, as the last pharaoh of Egypt, as a queen whose beauty launched 1,000 rumors. But before I was any of those things, I was a young woman fighting for her very survival, learning that the crown means nothing if you haven't earned the right to wear it in your own heart. Let me paint for you the world I inhabited in those desperate days. It was the year 48 BCE, and Egypt stood at a crossroads between the old world and the new. The Roman Republic stretched its mighty fingers across the Mediterranean, and my beloved Alexandria, that jewel of learning and culture, found itself caught between tradition and transformation. My father had died 3 years prior, leaving Egypt's throne to myself and my younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, a child of merely 13, yet surrounded by vipers who whispered poison in his ears. The characters in this tale are etched in my memory with crystalline clarity. There was Pothinus, my brother's chief advisor, a eunuch whose castration had done nothing to diminish his hunger for power, only redirected it into more sinister channels. His plotting would set in motion the catastrophe that nearly destroyed me. Then there was Achillas, the general of Egypt's army, a military man whose loyalty could be bought and sold like grain in the marketplace. These two men formed the core of the conspiracy that tore me from my throne. But this story is not only about enemies. It is also about those who stood beside me when standing beside me meant certain death. Apollodorus the Sicilian, a merchant whose courage far exceeded his station, would become my most trusted ally. And Charmion, my handmaiden since childhood, whose loyalty never wavered, even when wisdom might have told her to abandon me. The great challenge I faced was not simply to survive, though survival itself seemed impossible at times, but to reclaim what was rightfully mine, without losing who I was in the process. I had to cross hostile territories, evade assassination attempts, build an army from nothing, and somehow find a way to outmaneuver enemies who controlled everything I had once commanded. But the deeper challenge, the one that truly tested me, was internal. How do you maintain your humanity when the world is trying to make you into a monster? How do you hold on to love and compassion when everyone you meet might be planning your murder? I will not tell you yet how I managed to return to Alexandria in triumph, how I orchestrated one of the most daring political maneuvers in history, and how I transformed from a fugitive princess into a true queen. Those revelations will come in time. as we journey together through the scorching deserts, the dangerous coastal cities, and the treacherous political landscape of ancient Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean. What I can tell you is this. The woman who fled Alexandria in the dead of night was not the same woman who returned months later. That journey stripped away everything superficial, everything borrowed, everything I thought I knew about power and about myself. It left only what was essential, what was true, what was unbreakable. This is a love story, yes, though perhaps not in the way you might expect. It is a story about my love for Egypt, for my people, for the very idea of who I could become. And yes, there is romance woven through these events, moments of connection and passion that sustained me when all else seemed lost. So settle in, dear listener, and let me take you back to that fateful night when everything changed. Let me show you the Cleopatra you never knew, the one who had to lose everything to find out what she was truly made of. The story begins in my palace in Alexandria, in my private chambers, in the hours before dawn, when the first whispers of betrayal reached my ears.
The night air in Alexandria carried the scent of jasmine and salt from the harbor, mixing with the smoke from 1,000 oil lamps that kept the great city alive, even in darkness. I remember that smell so vividly, how it drifted through the silk curtains of my bedchamber in the royal palace. It was the smell of home, of safety, of everything I was about to lose. I was not asleep when Charmion entered my room. Sleep had become a stranger to me in those months since my father's death, since I had been forced to share power with a brother who despised me, since the Regency Council, those parasites who truly ruled Egypt, had begun. I was sitting at my writing desk, studying reports from the provinces by lamplight, wearing a simple linen gown the color of cream, my black hair loose around my shoulders. I had dismissed my other attendants hours ago. Only Charmion had permission to disturb me at such hours. Charmion was a woman of perhaps 30 years, though the exact number remained her secret. She had been born in the palace to a Nubian mother and a Greek father, and her heritage showed in the rich darkness of her skin and the sharp intelligence in her amber-colored eyes. She was tall and moved with a dancer's grace, though she had trained as a scribe and spoke 6 languages fluently. That night, she wore the deep blue robes of a palace servant, but her expression carried none of the deference her position demanded. We had grown up together, and she knew me too well for pretense. "My lady," she said, and the tremor in her voice made me set down my stylus immediately. "Apollodorus is here. He says it cannot wait until morning." Apollodorus the Sicilian was not supposed to be in Alexandria at all. He was supposed to be in Pelusium, the fortress city on our eastern border, managing a shipment of grain from Syria. The fact that he had returned ahead of schedule in the middle of the night without sending word ahead could only mean one thing: disaster. "Bring him in," I said, rising from my desk. "And Charmion, bar the door behind you. Trust no one tonight." Apollodorus entered moments later, and the sight of him confirmed my worst fears. He was a compact man, muscular from years of loading and unloading cargo ships, with the weathered skin of someone who spent more time under the sun than under roofs. His hair was dark and curly, cut short in the Greek fashion, and his eyes were the gray-green of the sea he sailed. Normally, those eyes sparkled with humor and cunning. Tonight, they were hard with urgency. He wore a traveling cloak still dusty from the road, and I could see the handle of a dagger at his belt. Unusual for a merchant in the palace, but then these were unusual times. He was perhaps 40 years old, though his energy made him seem younger. He dropped to one knee before me, but I gestured impatiently for him to rise. "Speak freely, Apollodorus. What has happened?"
Pothinus has made his move, my queen. His voice was low and urgent, his Greek accented with the soft vowels of Sicily. The Regency Council met in secret 2 days ago. They have declared you in violation of the co-regency agreement. Achillas has been ordered to arrest you at dawn and confine you to house imprisonment, pending a trial before the council. The words should have shocked me, but instead I felt an odd sense of clarity, as if I had been waiting for this moment without realizing it. On what charges? They claim you have been corresponding with Rome without your brother's knowledge, that you have been making decisions about temple appointments and provincial governance without consulting the council. They say you seek to rule alone, to push Pothinus aside and break the terms of your father's will. Every charge was technically true, and yet all of them were absurd. Of course I had been making decisions. Someone had to actually govern Egypt, while my 13-year-old brother played with his toys and Pothinus played at being kingmaker. Of course I had written to Rome. We needed their wheat imports, and someone had to maintain those relationships. And what does my dear brother think of all this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Apollodorus's expression darkened. Ptolemy signs whatever Pothinus puts before him. The boy is completely under his control. But there is worse news, my lady. Achillas has been given orders. He hesitated, glancing at Charmion, who had moved to stand beside me. If you resist arrest, if there is any sign you might flee, his men have permission to kill you. They're calling it preventative security. So, it had come to this. My own brother, or rather, the men who controlled him, had ordered my death. I walked to the window and looked out over Alexandria, my city, the greatest city in the world. The lighthouse on Pharos Island sent its beams sweeping across the harbor, guiding ships safely to port as it had for over 200 years. The great library stood silent in the darkness, containing more knowledge than existed anywhere else on earth. The temples, the theaters, the markets, the palaces, all of it mine by birth and by right, and all of it about to be torn from my grasp. How much time do we have? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm building inside me. 3 hours till dawn, maybe 4. Achillas is gathering his men now. He will come with at least 50 soldiers. He is taking no chances.
I turned back to face them, these 2 loyal souls who had risked everything to warn me. In that moment, I made the decision that would define everything that followed. I would not wait meekly for arrest. I would not let them put me in chains and parade me before a kangaroo court. If I was going to fall, I would fall fighting. But more than that, I would not fall at all. Then we leave, I said simply, within the hour. Charmion, pack only what we can carry, essential items only, jewelry we can sell, documents that prove my legitimacy, practical clothes for travel, nothing that will slow us down. Apollodorus, do you still have your ship in the harbor? He nodded, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. The Isis, yes, a small merchant vessel, nothing fancy, but she is fast and seaworthy. I have a crew of 8 men, all loyal. We can be ready to sail before dawn. Good, we sail east, toward Pelusium. I need to reach the border regions, where I still have supporters. I need to raise an army. The words sounded absurd even as I spoke them. I was 21 years old, a queen with no kingdom, and I was proposing to challenge the full military might of Egypt's standing army with nothing but determination and desperate hope. But Apollodorus did not laugh. Instead, he bowed his head in respect. I will prepare the ship immediately. Meet me at the merchant's dock in the eastern harbor. Not the royal docks, they will be watched. There is a warehouse owned by a friend, number 47 in the waterfront district. Come to the back entrance. I will have everything ready." After he left, Charmion and I worked in feverish silence. I changed into a simple traveling dress of dark wool, sturdy and practical, the kind a merchant's wife might wear. Over it, I wore a hooded cloak that would hide my distinctive features. I packed a small chest with jewelry, gold armbands, pearl necklaces, rings set with emeralds and sapphires, all of which could be converted to coin when needed. I also took my father's royal seal, hidden in a leather pouch, proof of my legitimacy should I need it. And I took scrolls, copies of treaties, correspondence with provincial governors, letters from scholars and priests who supported me. These documents were my claim to legitimacy, more valuable than any crown. The hardest decision was what to leave behind. My library, collected over years of study, my clothes, hundreds of gowns in every color imaginable, my musical instruments, my cosmetics and perfumes, all the beautiful, useless trappings of royalty. I was learning the first lesson of exile. You can only carry what truly matters, and most of what we think matters does not. We made our way through the palace using servants' corridors I had explored as a child, passages that the guards did not watch because they assumed no one of importance would use. The palace was vast, a sprawling complex of buildings and courtyards that covered acres of Alexandria's royal quarter. We passed through the kitchens, still warm from the evening's cooking, through storage rooms filled with grain and oil, through the quarters where servants slept in crowded rooms. At one point, we had to pause in a shadowed alcove as a patrol of guards marched past. I pressed myself against the cold stone wall, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain they would hear it. Charmion's hand found mine in the darkness and squeezed. The guards passed without noticing us, their torches casting dancing shadows, their voices discussing tomorrow's duties, without any idea that the queen they served was standing mere feet away, fleeing for her life. When we finally emerged into the city proper, I felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. The streets of Alexandria at night were not entirely empty. This was a city that never truly slept. We passed night soil collectors, prostitutes returning from their work, drunken sailors staggering back to their ships, bakers already preparing for the morning's bread. To all of them, we were just two more cloaked figures in the darkness, unremarkable and unimportant. The eastern harbor was quieter than the Great Harbor, used primarily for coastal trade rather than the massive grain ships from Rome. The smell here was stronger, fish and tar and unwashed bodies, the honest smell of working people rather than the perfumed air of the palace. Warehouse 47 was easy to find, marked with a painted sign showing the goddess Isis holding a ship's sail. Apollodorus met us at the back entrance, his face relieved when he saw us. "Thank the gods, I was beginning to worry you had been discovered. Come, quickly, we need to be away from the docks before the harbormaster makes his morning rounds." The Isis was a beautiful little ship, perhaps 60 feet long, with a single large sail and a shallow draft that would allow her to navigate coastal waters and river mouths. Her hull was painted red, and her prow bore a carved image of her namesake goddess, wings spread in protection. Apollodorus's crew were already aboard, working by lamplight to prepare for departure. They were a rough-looking bunch, Phoenicians and Greeks and one massive Egyptian with a scarred face, but they moved with practiced efficiency, and not one of them questioned my presence. As Apollodorus helped me aboard, I took one last look at Alexandria. The lighthouse beams swept across the harbor entrance, that eternal guardian watching over the city. The palace complex rose white and magnificent on its promontory, home to the Ptolemies for nearly 300 years. My home, my birthright, my prison. "We will return," Charmion whispered beside me, as if reading my thoughts. "This is not the end, my lady. It is merely an interruption." I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. But as the Isis slipped her moorings and began to glide toward the harbor entrance, powered by the crew's oars and the still morning air, I could not shake the feeling that I was leaving behind everything I had ever known, sailing toward an uncertain future with no guarantees of survival, let alone victory.
The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with streaks of pink and gold when we passed the lighthouse and entered the open sea. I stood at the stern, watching Alexandria shrink behind us, and I felt tears on my cheeks for the first time that night. I had been so focused on escape, on survival, on the practical necessities of flight that I had not allowed myself to feel the loss. But now, with the salt spray on my face and the deck rolling beneath my feet, the reality crashed over me like a wave. I was no longer Queen of Egypt. I was a fugitive, hunted by my own brother's forces, with nothing but the clothes on my back and the loyalty of a handful of companions. I had no army, no treasury, no power base. I was, quite possibly, the most vulnerable I had ever been in my entire life. And yet, as I stood there watching the sun rise over the sea, I felt something stirring inside me that I had never felt before. It was not the borrowed confidence of someone who ruled because of their birth, or the hollow authority of someone who commanded because of their title. It was something deeper, something earned, something real. I was afraid, yes. I was uncertain. I was grieving for what I had lost. But I was also free. Free from the constraints of the palace, free from the expectations and protocols that had defined every moment of my life since birth. Free to discover who Cleopatra truly was beneath all the crowns and ceremonies. Apollodorus approached me as we set course eastward along the coast. "My queen," he said, and then corrected himself with a slight smile. "My lady, we should discuss our destination. Pelusium is the obvious choice. It is the closest major city, and you have supporters there. But it is also the most obvious, which means Achillas will expect us to go there. He could have troops waiting." I considered this. Pelusium was indeed the logical destination. It was a fortress city, wealthy from trade, and its garrison commander had always been loyal to my father. But Apollodorus was right. It was too obvious. "What are our other options?" I asked. "We could sail further east, to the coast of Judea or Syria. There are Nabatean traders who owe me favors. We could shelter there while we make plans. Or we could sail south to Upper Egypt, where the old priesthoods still hold influence. They have never loved Pothinus or the Regency Council." Before I could answer, one of the crew members, the big Egyptian with the scarred face, called out from the mast where he was keeping watch. "Sail! Military trireme coming fast from the harbor!" My blood turned to ice. They had discovered my flight faster than I had hoped. Achillas must have sent men to arrest me early, perhaps not trusting his own timeline. And now they were coming after us. Apollodorus moved immediately into action, shouting orders to his crew. "Raise the sail! Every man to the oars! We need speed now!" The Isis leaped forward as her sail caught the morning breeze, and the crew bent to their oars with desperate energy. But I could see the trireme behind us, larger and faster, its 3 banks of oars churning the water white. It was a warship, built for speed and ramming, and it was gaining on us. "Can we outrun them?" I asked Apollodorus, though I already knew the answer from his expression. Not in open water, he admitted, but if we can reach the shallows near the coast, we might be able to lose them. The Isis has a shallow draft. We can go places that trireme cannot follow. But we need time and distance, and a great deal of luck. I watched the warship bearing down on us, and I realized that my flight from Alexandria was going to be far more difficult than I had imagined. This was not merely about slipping away quietly. My enemies were not going to let me go. They were going to hunt me across the length of Egypt if necessary, and they had all the resources of the kingdom at their disposal. But I also realized something else, something that crystallized in that moment of danger. I was not going to make this easy for them. If they wanted to catch me, they were going to have to work for it. And if they thought that stripping away my crown had stripped away my intelligence, my resourcefulness, or my will to fight, they were about to learn otherwise. "Take us into the shallows," I told Apollodorus. "Use every trick you know. Do whatever you must. We are not letting them catch us today." He grinned at me then, that reckless smile I would come to know so well in the months ahead. "As you command, my lady. Hold tight, this is going to be rough." And as the Isis turned toward the coast, with the trireme closing fast behind us, and the sun now fully risen over the Mediterranean, I felt the first stirrings of something I had not expected to feel. Excitement. Yes, I was fleeing for my life. Yes, I had lost everything, but I was also alive, truly alive, in a way I had never been in the gilded cage of the palace. The game was afoot, the chase had begun, and I was determined to prove to myself and to my enemies that Queen Cleopatra was far from finished.
The coastal waters near Alexandria were treacherous, filled with hidden sandbars and rocky outcroppings that could tear the hull from a ship if the captain did not know what he was doing. Fortunately, Apollodorus knew these waters like he knew the lines on his own hands. He had been sailing these routes since he was barely old enough to hold a tiller, trading up and down the Egyptian coast, and that knowledge was about to save our lives. "There!" he shouted, pointing toward a stretch of water that looked no different from any other to my untrained eye. "Between those two rock formations, there is a channel, barely deep enough for us, but impossible for a trireme. If we can make it through, we will have hours on them while they are forced to go around." The crew responded instantly, adjusting the sail and the oars to aim us toward what looked like certain destruction. I gripped the rail of the ship, my knuckles white, as we raced toward the rocks. Behind us, the trireme was close enough now that I could see individual soldiers on its deck, could see the bronze ram at its prow that was designed to split enemy ships in half. The morning sun glinted off their armor and spears, and I could hear the rhythmic beating of their drum keeping time for the oarsmen. Charmion stood beside me, her face composed but her hands clasped tightly together in a silent prayer to whatever gods she favored. "My lady," she said softly, "if we do not survive this, I want you to know that serving you has been the greatest honor of my life." "We are going to survive," I told her firmly, though my heart was hammering in my chest. "And when we return to Alexandria in triumph, you will tell this story to your grandchildren." The Isis plunged between the rocks with barely a hand's breadth to spare on either side. I could have reached out and touched the barnacle-encrusted stone as we passed. The water here was shallow enough that I could see the sandy bottom racing beneath us, could see schools of fish scattering from our path. One miscalculation, one moment of inattention from Apollodorus, and we would run aground and be trapped. But Apollodorus did not miscalculate. The Isis threaded the needle perfectly, emerging on the other side of the rocks into calmer waters beyond. Behind us, I heard shouts of frustration from the trireme as it was forced to veer away, unable to follow our path. We had bought ourselves time. "Keep going," Apollodorus ordered his crew. They will have to sail around to the north. That gives us perhaps 2 hours before they can pick up our trail again. We need to use that time wisely. For the next several hours, we sailed eastward along the coast, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and our pursuers. The morning was beautiful, the sky cloudless and blue, the sea sparkling in the sunlight. It would have been pleasant under other circumstances. As it was, I could not stop looking back over my shoulder, expecting at any moment to see that trireme reappear on the horizon. As the sun climbed higher, Apollodorus called a brief rest for his crew and came to speak with me. We stood at the prow of the ship, where we could talk privately without being overheard. He said, "We need to make a decision soon," he said, his expression serious. "We cannot keep sailing aimlessly along the coast. Eventually, they will catch us. If not that trireme, then another ship they send after us. We need a destination, a plan, somewhere we can go to ground and regroup." I had been thinking about this since we fled Alexandria, turning over possibilities in my mind. "Tell me honestly, Apollodorus, what are my chances of raising an army to challenge Achillas and Pothinus? Can it be done?" He was silent for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "It can be done," he said finally, "but it will not be easy and it will not be quick. You will need money to hire mercenaries. You will need weapons and supplies. You will need a base of operations where you can train and organize. And most importantly, you will need legitimacy. You will need to convince people that you are the rightful ruler of Egypt, not a rebel or a usurper." "I am the rightful ruler," I said, perhaps more sharply than I intended. "My father named me co-regent with my brother. The Regency Council has no authority to remove me." "I know that, my lady, and you know that, but we need to convince the people of Egypt. And more than the people, we need to convince Rome. Egypt cannot stand without Rome's support, or at least Rome's neutrality. You know this as well as I do." He was right, of course. Egypt had been effectively a client state of Rome for decades, ever since my father had borrowed enormous sums from Roman moneylenders to secure his throne. We paid tribute to Rome in grain and gold, and in return, Rome kept its legions out of Egypt and allowed us to maintain the fiction of independence. But that arrangement was fragile, dependent on Rome believing that Egypt was stable and well-governed. If civil war broke out, Rome might decide to intervene directly, and that would be the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty forever. "Then we need to reach someone in Rome who can help us," I said, thinking aloud. "Someone with the power and influence to support my claim. But who? Pompey is occupied with his war against Caesar. The Senate is divided and weak. Who in Rome would risk supporting an exiled queen with no army and no resources?" Apollodorus smiled slightly. "I may have an answer to that question. I have been hearing news from my trading contacts. Julius Caesar has just arrived in Alexandria. He came with only a small force, perhaps 4,000 men, pursuing Pompey after his defeat at Pharsalus. Caesar is the most powerful man in Rome right now, and he is sitting in your city as we speak." Julius Caesar. The name sent a shiver through me, though whether of hope or fear I could not say. I knew of him, of course. Everyone in the civilized world knew of Caesar. He was the conqueror of Gaul, the man who had crossed the Rubicon and plunged Rome into civil war, the general who had just defeated Pompey the Great in battle. He was brilliant, ruthless, ambitious, and reportedly insatiable in his appetites for both power and pleasure. He was also, if the reports were accurate, a man who appreciated intelligence and boldness, a man who might be intrigued by a young queen fighting to reclaim her throne, a man who needed Egypt's wealth and grain to fuel his own ambitions. "If Caesar is in Alexandria," I said slowly, "then I need to get to him before Pothinus and my brother can poison him against me. I need to present my case directly, to show him that supporting me serves Rome's interests better than supporting a council of corrupt advisors and a child king." "Agreed," Apollodorus said. "But how do you propose to do that? Achillas controls Alexandria. The palace is in his hands. Caesar is likely being hosted there, surrounded by guards loyal to your brother. You cannot simply walk up to the palace gates and request an audience." I smiled despite our desperate situation. "No, I cannot do that. But I can do something else. Something unexpected. Something that will get Caesar's attention and demonstrate exactly the kind of queen I am." Over the next hour, I outlined my plan to Apollodorus and Charmion. It was audacious, possibly insane, certainly dangerous. But it had one quality that recommended it above all others. It might actually work. First, however, we needed to deal with the immediate problem of survival. We could not sail directly back to Alexandria, not yet, not until we had gathered resources and intelligence. Instead, Apollodorus suggested we make for a small fishing village called Anthilla, about a day's sail to the east. It was remote enough that Achillas's forces would be unlikely to look for us there, but large enough that we could purchase supplies and gather information. We reached Anthilla as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The village was a humble place, perhaps 50 houses clustered around a small harbor with fishing boats pulled up on the beach and nets spread out to dry. The people here were simple folk, fishermen and their families, far removed from the political intrigues of Alexandria. To them, the drama of who sat on the Egyptian throne was less important than whether the fish were running and whether the harvest would be good. Apollodorus had contacts here, as he seemed to have contacts everywhere. We were taken to the home of a retired sea captain named Nicanor, a weathered old Greek with one eye and a magnificent gray beard. His house was modest, but clean, smelling of fish and lamp oil, with walls of whitewashed mud brick and a roof of palm fronds. Nicanor took one look at me and my travel-stained cloak and said, "I do not know who you are, and I do not want to know, but any friend of Apollodorus is welcome in my home. You can stay as long as you need, ask no questions, and tell no lies." It was good advice. That night we ate a simple meal of fish stew and bread, and I slept for the first time in what felt like days on a pallet of reeds in Nicanor's guest room. Charmion slept beside me, and I could hear Apollodorus and his crew bedding down in the main room. Despite everything, despite the uncertainty and danger, I felt oddly safe in that humble fisherman's house. The next morning, Apollodorus went into the village to gather intelligence and purchase supplies, while I remained hidden in Nicanor's house. It was frustrating to be confined, to be unable to move freely, but I understood the necessity. If word got out that Queen Cleopatra was hiding in Anthilla, Achillas would descend on the village with his full force, and innocent people would suffer. While I waited, Charmion helped me with a transformation. If I was going to move through Egypt gathering support, I could not look like a queen in exile. I needed to look like someone ordinary, someone forgettable. We dyed my hair darker using a mixture of henna and indigo that Nicanor's wife provided. We stained my skin with walnut oil to make it browner, more weathered. We dressed me in the simple clothes of a traveling merchant's wife, rough linen dyed brown, with a shawl to cover my hair and shadow my face. When Charmion held up a polished bronze mirror for me to see the result, I barely recognized myself. The pampered princess of Alexandria had vanished, replaced by someone who could have been any woman from any village along the coast. It was exactly what I needed. Apollodorus returned in the afternoon with news, supplies, and most valuably, information. He put out word that you fled Alexandria with stolen royal property, that you are a danger to the kingdom and anyone harboring you will be considered a traitor. He is offering a substantial reward for information leading to your capture. How substantial? I asked. 50 talents of silver. I let out a low whistle. 50 talents was an enormous sum, enough to make even loyal supporters think twice about aiding me. It was also an indication of how seriously Pothinus and Achillas took the threat I represented. They weren't just trying to remove me from power, they were trying to ensure I could never return. There is more, Apollodorus continued. Caesar is indeed in Alexandria, and he has declared himself mediator in the dispute between you and your brother. He has summoned both of you to appear before him to present your cases. Pothinus has convinced Ptolemy to accept, of course. You are officially invited to present your claim with a guarantee of safe conduct." "A guarantee from whom?" I asked skeptically. "From Caesar or from Pothinus?" "From Caesar himself, apparently. The message was sent throughout the eastern provinces. Caesar wants to resolve the Egyptian succession question quickly so he can secure Egypt's grain supply and move on with his campaign against Pompey's remaining supporters." I considered this carefully. A summons from Caesar changed everything. If I could reach him, if I could present my case directly, I might be able to win his support. But the safe conduct guarantee was worthless if I could not reach Caesar alive. Pothinus and Achillas would never allow me to simply walk into the palace and speak with the Roman general. They would arrange an accident long before I got anywhere near him. "So we need to get into Alexandria," Charmion said, reading my thoughts. "Into the palace itself, past Achillas's guards, and into Caesar's presence. Impossible." "Not impossible," I said. "Difficult, yes. Dangerous, certainly, but not impossible. In fact, I think I know exactly how to do it." I explained my plan to them in detail. With each sentence, Apollodorus's smile grew wider, and Charmion's expression grew more alarmed. "My lady," Charmion said when I finished, "that is, without question, the most audacious, reckless, and potentially suicidal plan I have ever heard. If anything goes wrong—" "If anything goes wrong, I will be no worse off than I am now," I interrupted. "Charmion, I am already a fugitive with a price on my head. I have already lost my throne. The only question is whether I spend the rest of my life running and hiding, or whether I take a chance on reclaiming what is rightfully mine. This plan gives me that chance. It also gives Caesar a chance to see exactly what kind of woman I am. Not a pampered princess waiting for men to solve her problems, but someone bold enough to take risks, clever enough to outthink her enemies, and determined enough to bet everything on one roll of the dice. Those are qualities Caesar understands and respects. If I can get in front of him, if I can speak with him face to face, I believe I can win his support." Apollodorus nodded slowly. "I think you are right. Caesar did not become master of Rome by being cautious. He appreciates audacity. And this plan? Well, it is certainly audacious. But we will need help. We will need someone inside Alexandria, someone who can provide intelligence about the palace, about Caesar's location and schedule, about Achillas' dart rotations. I know someone. Diomedes, the physician. He served my father and remained in the palace as court physician. He has no love for Pothinus, and he owes my family his position. If I can get a message to him, I believe he will help us." "I can get a message into Alexandria," Apollodorus said. "I still have contacts among the merchant guilds. It will take a few days, but it can be done." And so we set our plan in motion. For the next week, we remained in Anthilla, while Apollodorus made careful, secret contact with allies in Alexandria. Messages went back and forth, encoded in merchant correspondence about grain shipments and textile orders. Slowly, we built a network of information and support. During this time, I learned more about the situation in Alexandria. Caesar had indeed taken up residence in the royal palace, though he maintained only a small force of Roman soldiers with him. He was treating the palace as neutral territory, hosting both my brother's faction and, theoretically, mine, though of course I was conspicuously absent. Pothinus was playing the gracious host, providing Caesar with every luxury, trying to secure his support for Ptolemy's sole rule. More worryingly, I learned that Achillas's army was growing. He had called up reserves throughout Egypt, assembling a force that now numbered over 20,000 men. This was not just about removing me from power anymore. This was preparation for something larger. I suspected that Pothinus and Achillas were planning to move against Caesar himself, to force him out of Egypt, or perhaps even to kill him if they could arrange it without obvious Egyptian involvement. This knowledge added urgency to my plan. If Achillas moved against Caesar before I could reach him, everything would collapse into chaos. Egypt would descend into civil war, Rome would invade, and the Ptolemaic dynasty would end in blood and fire. Through Diomedes, we learned that Caesar held court each evening in the great hall of the palace, hearing petitions and conducting business. He kept Roman hours, working late into the night and sleeping only a few hours before dawn. His personal guards were with him always, but they were a small force, perhaps 50 men at most. The rest of the palace was controlled by Achillas's soldiers, several hundred of them, loyal to Pothinus and my brother. The message from Diomedes was clear. If I was going to reach Caesar, it would have to be at night, when the palace was quieter and there were fewer guards on patrol. And it would have to be soon, because rumors were spreading that Achillas was planning to move his army into Alexandria itself, surrounding the palace and forcing Caesar to accept Pothinus's terms. On the 8th day after our arrival in Anthilla, Apollodorus returned from Alexandria with everything we needed. He had secured false documents identifying us as Syrian merchants. He had obtained detailed maps of the palace showing the locations of guards and the layout of rooms. Most importantly, he had received a message from Diomedes indicating the perfect night for our attempt. 3 days hence, when Caesar would be holding a small private dinner with selected guests, and Pothinus would be distracted entertaining a delegation from Upper Egypt. "It is as good an opportunity as we are likely to get," Apollodorus said, "but we must be clear about the risks. If we are caught before we reach Caesar, Achillas will kill us all, slowly. And there is no guarantee that even if we do reach Caesar, he will support you. He might decide that siding with Ptolemy and Pothinus is safer, easier, more profitable." "Then I will have to convince him otherwise," I said simply. "Charmion, are you certain you want to come with me? This is going to be dangerous, and I would not blame you if you chose to remain here in safety."
Charmion looked at me with those amber eyes, and I saw in them the same determination I felt in my own heart. "My lady, I have followed you this far. I will follow you the rest of the way, whatever comes. Besides, someone needs to make sure you do not do anything too reckless." I laughed despite the tension. "Too late for that. This entire plan is nothing but recklessness." We spent the next 2 days preparing carefully. I practiced my story, who I was supposed to be, where I had come from, what business brought me to Alexandria. Apollodorus drilled me on Syrian customs and dialect, teaching me to speak Greek with a Syrian accent, to use Syrian mannerisms and gestures. By the time we were ready to leave, I could have convinced anyone that I was exactly what I appeared to be, a merchant's wife traveling with her husband, unremarkable and forgettable. The night before we were to sail back to Alexandria, I could not sleep. I lay on my pallet, listening to the sound of the waves on the beach, thinking about everything that had brought me to this point. I thought about my father, how he had struggled to maintain Egypt's independence while dealing with Rome's growing power. I thought about my mother, dead so many years I could barely remember her face. I thought about my brother, that child who had been turned into a puppet by ambitious men. And I thought about who I was becoming. The woman lying in that fisherman's house was not the same woman who had fled Alexandria barely 2 weeks earlier. That woman had been a queen by birth, by title, by inheritance. But she had not truly earned the crown she wore. She had been given power, but she had not yet proven herself worthy of it. The woman I was becoming understood that power is not given, it is taken, earned, fought for. The woman I was becoming knew that survival required more than royal blood.
It required intelligence, courage, adaptability, and a willingness to risk everything for what you believed in. Tomorrow, I would return to Alexandria. I would infiltrate my own palace, sneak past guards who had sworn oaths to protect me but now wanted me dead, and gamble everything on a meeting with a Roman general who had no particular reason to support me. It was madness. It was desperation. It was also the most alive I had ever felt. As dawn broke over Anthilla, we loaded our few possessions onto the Isis and prepared to sail. Nicanor came to see us off, pressing a small carved wooden fish into my hand. He said, "For luck. My father gave it to me when I first went to sea. It has kept me safe through many storms. Perhaps it will do the same for you." I closed my hand around the little carving, feeling its smooth contours worn by decades of handling. "Thank you, Nicanor. When I return to Alexandria as queen, you will be rewarded for your kindness." He shook his head. "I do not want rewards. I just want to live my life in peace. But I hope you succeed, whoever you are. Egypt needs rulers who are willing to fight for it, not ones who sit in palaces and let advisors make all the decisions." He gave me a knowing look then, and I realized that he had known exactly who I was all along. He had simply chosen to help anyway, without asking for anything in return. The voyage back to Alexandria took most of the day. We sailed boldly into the great harbor in late afternoon, just another merchant vessel among dozens of others. The Isis was searched by harbor inspectors, a new security measure instituted by Achillas, but our false documents passed inspection, and the guards saw nothing suspicious about a Syrian merchant and his wife arriving to do business in Egypt's greatest city. As we sailed past the lighthouse on Pharos Island, I looked up at the palace complex on its promontory, white and magnificent in the afternoon sun. My home, my prison, my destination. Somewhere in those buildings, Julius Caesar was conducting the business of the Roman Republic, unaware that a dispossessed queen was about to gamble everything on one bold move. Somewhere in those buildings, Pothinus and Achillas were spinning their webs of conspiracy, confident that they had secured their position, unaware that their carefully constructed plans were about to be disrupted by the very person they thought they had eliminated. And somewhere in those buildings, perhaps, was my destiny, whatever that might turn out to be. We docked at the merchant's harbor as the sun was setting, and I stepped off the Isis onto the stones of Alexandria for the first time since my flight. I was home, and yet I was a stranger in my own city, disguised and hunted, about to attempt something that would save me or destroy me utterly. There was no turning back now. The game had entered its final phase, and within hours I would know whether my gamble had paid off or whether I had thrown away my last chance at the throne. Apollodorus squeezed my shoulder briefly. He asked me, "Ready?" I took a deep breath, adjusted my merchant's shawl, and nodded. "Ready. Let us go and introduce ourselves to Julius Caesar."
The streets of Alexandria at night were both familiar and alien to me. I had lived in the city my entire life, but always from the perspective of royalty, carried in litters, surrounded by guards, moving through spaces that had been cleared and secured before my arrival. Now, walking these same streets disguised as a common merchant's wife, I saw Alexandria as most of its inhabitants saw it: crowded, chaotic, dangerous, and vibrantly alive. We moved through the merchant quarter as darkness fell, 3 figures among thousands in the lamp-lit streets. Apollodorus led the way, moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged here. Charmion walked beside me, her hand occasionally touching my elbow to guide me around obstacles or steer me away from potential trouble. I kept my head down, my face shadowed by my shawl, playing the role of a modest woman following her husband through the city. The smells were overwhelming:
cooking meat and fish, human waste in the gutters, perfumes and incense from the shops still open for evening trade, the ever-present salt tang of the harbor. Voices called out in a dozen languages: Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, Latin, Phoenician, and tongues I could not identify. Street vendors hawked their wares, prostitutes called out to potential customers, drunks sang off-key songs, and children darted through the crowds like schools of fish. This was my city, my people, and I had never truly known them. In that moment, walking through those crowded streets, I felt a surge of emotion that surprised me with its intensity. These were the people I claimed to rule, and yet I knew nothing of their lives, their struggles, their hopes and fears. I had been so focused on the grand politics of kingdoms and dynasties that I had forgotten about the real Egypt, the Egypt of fishermen and bakers and weavers, the Egypt that existed regardless of who sat on the throne. If I survived this night, I promised myself, I would be a different kind of ruler. I would not hide behind palace walls. I would know my people, understand their needs, govern with wisdom rather than just inherited authority. But first, I had to survive this night. We reached the walls of the palace complex as the evening star appeared in the western sky. The palace was not a single building, but rather an extensive compound covering several acres of the royal quarter. It contained multiple palaces, administrative buildings, barracks, temples, gardens, and courtyards, all surrounded by high walls and guarded by soldiers loyal to whoever controlled the throne, which at present meant soldiers loyal to Achillas and Pothinus. The main gates were heavily guarded, with at least 20 soldiers visible and likely more nearby. There was no possibility of entering through those gates, even with false documents. But Apollodorus had not planned for us to use the main gates. He led us along the perimeter of the wall to a section near the harbor, where supply ships could unload cargo directly into the palace complex. Here, the wall was lower, and there were fewer guards because the area was considered secure from the seaside. More importantly, Diomedes had arranged for a particular gate to be left unlocked, a small service entrance used by servants and delivery workers. We waited in the shadows of a warehouse until the guard patrol passed, their torches casting dancing shadows on the palace walls. Then Apollodorus moved quickly to the gate, tested it carefully, and pushed it open. It swung inward with barely a sound. Diomedes had thought of everything, even oiling the hinges. Inside the palace complex, we moved like ghosts through familiar territory that now felt dangerous and foreign. I knew these paths, these courtyards, these buildings. I had played here as a child, walked here as a young woman. But now every shadow might conceal an enemy. Every footstep might belong to a guard who would recognize me despite my disguise. Diomedes met us in a storage room near the kitchens, a small chamber filled with amphoras of wine and oil. He was a thin man of perhaps 50 years, with gray hair and the careful movements of someone who spent his life around the sick and injured. His Greek heritage showed in his narrow face and pale skin, but his eyes were kind, the eyes of a healer. He wore the white robes of his profession, stained here and there with herbs and medicines. When he saw me, his eyes widened with recognition despite my disguise. He dropped to one knee immediately. "My queen," he whispered. "Rise, Diomedes," I said softly, "and speak quietly. We are not safe here." He stood, his hands trembling slightly. "I can hardly believe you are here, in the palace itself. The risk is necessary. Tell me about Caesar. Where is he now? What is his mood? And most importantly, can we reach him?" Diomedes glanced nervously at the door, then spoke rapidly in a low voice. "Caesar is in the royal apartments on the second floor of the main palace. He has taken over your father's old rooms. Pothinus offered him his choice of accommodations, and he chose those. He works late into the night, usually until the third watch.
Right now, he should be dining privately with a small group of advisors and officers. There are Roman guards outside his door, perhaps 10 men, but they are alert and disciplined. Getting past them will be difficult. "What about Achillas's guards?" Apollodorus asked. "How many in the palace tonight?" "Perhaps 200 throughout the complex, but most are concentrated near the main gates and the throne room. The residential areas have lighter security. Achillas assumes no threat could penetrate that far into the palace. He is more concerned with external attacks than with internal ones." I felt a grim smile cross my face. Achillas's arrogance would be his undoing. He had forgotten the first rule of palace intrigue. The deadliest threats come from within, not without. "Can you get us to the second floor?" I asked Diomedes. "To somewhere near Caesar's apartments?" "There are servants' passages," he said slowly. "Narrow stairs that the household staff use to move through the palace without disturbing the nobility. They are not guarded because no one thinks they are important. I can guide you through them to a point very close to Caesar's rooms. But from there, you will have to deal with the Roman guards yourself." "That is all we need," I said. "Once we reach the guards, I have a plan."
Diomedes looked at me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "My queen, what you are attempting, even if you reach Caesar, there is no guarantee he will support you. He might turn you over to Pothinus. He might decide you are more trouble than you are worth." "That is a risk I must take," I said simply. "But I do not think Caesar will turn me over. Everything I have heard about him suggests he appreciates boldness, and what I am about to do is certainly bold. Besides, I have something to offer him that Pothinus and my brother do not." "What is that?" Diomedes asked. "Legitimacy," I said, "and stability. Caesar needs Egypt secure and peaceful so he can move on with his campaigns. A child pharaoh controlled by scheming advisors cannot provide that. But I can. I am the rightful heiress. I am of age. I am intelligent enough to govern, and I am willing to work with Rome rather than against it. That is what Caesar needs, even if he does not realize it yet." Diomedes nodded slowly. "You have changed, my queen. When last I saw you, before your flight, you were still in some ways a girl playing at being ruler. Now you have the bearing of someone who has earned the title." His words struck me deeply because they were true. The woman standing in that storage room was not the same person who had fled Alexandria 2 weeks earlier. Loss and hardship and danger had burned away the superficial elements of my identity, leaving only what was essential. I had learned who I was when everything else was stripped away, and what I had found was stronger than I had known. "Come," Diomedes said. "We should move quickly. Caesar's dinner will end soon, and we need you in position before his guests leave." He led us through a maze of servant passages I had never known existed. These were narrow, dim corridors, lit only by occasional oil lamps, with walls of plain stone rather than the painted and gilded surfaces of the main palace. We climbed steep stairs designed for servants carrying heavy loads, passed through storage areas and workrooms, and emerged finally in a small alcove on the second floor, just around a corner from Caesar's apartments. Through a crack in a decorative screen, I could see the hallway outside Caesar's rooms. It was wide and well lit, with walls painted in the Egyptian style, showing scenes of pharaohs making offerings to the gods. 10 Roman soldiers stood guard outside a set of double doors, all of them alert and armed. They wore the distinctive segmented armor of the legions, carried the short swords called gladi, and had the hard, competent look of men who had survived many battles. Getting past them through force or deception was impossible, but I had not planned to use force or deception. "This is where I leave you," Diomedes whispered. "I must return to my duties before I am missed. May the gods protect you, my queen." He pressed a small vial into my hand. "If things go badly, this is a quick poison. Painless. Better than what Achillas would do to you if you are caught." I looked at the vial, then back at Diomedes. "Thank you for your loyalty and your care.
but I will not need this. I am going to survive this night, and I am going to take back my throne." After Diomedes left, I turned to Apollodorus and Charmion. "This is the dangerous part. Are you both ready?" "Ready," Apollodorus said, though his hand rested on the dagger at his belt. "My lady, once you go through with this, there is no going back. If Caesar rejects you, if he turns you over to Pothinus, we will all die." "I know, but if we do nothing, we will die anyway, slowly, as fugitives hunted across Egypt until we are inevitably caught. At least this way we die boldly, attempting something magnificent. And if we succeed, we change everything." I had told them my plan in Anthilla, but now it was time to execute it. The plan was simple, audacious, and completely insane. It relied on surprise, on boldness, on Caesar being exactly the kind of man I believed him to be. If I was wrong about his character, if I had misjudged him, this would be the last mistake I ever made. "Apollodorus," I said, "it is time. You know what to do." He nodded and disappeared back into the servant passages. Charmion and I waited in tense silence, listening to the muffled sounds of the palace around us. Distant voices, footsteps, the clank of armor as guards made their rounds. Minutes stretched like hours. Then I heard it, Apollodorus's voice from somewhere below, raised in apparent alarm. "Fire! Fire in the kitchens! Someone fetch water!" The reaction was immediate. Several of the Roman guards turned toward the sound, hands on weapons, clearly conflicted between staying at their posts and responding to a potential emergency. Their commander, a sentry with a scarred face and gray in his hair, barked orders in Latin. "Marcus, Julius, go investigate. The rest of you maintain position. This could be a diversion." 2 guards ran off toward the kitchens. The remaining 8 stayed at their posts, but they were distracted now, their attention divided. It was the opening I needed. I stepped out from behind the screen, moving with purpose and confidence, despite the fear coursing through me. Charmion stayed in the shadows. This part I had to do alone. The guards saw me immediately and raised their weapons. The centurion stepped forward, his hand on his sword hilt. "Halt! State your business here." I spoke in Greek, keeping my accent deliberately common, playing the role of a merchant's wife. "Please, sir, I have an urgent message for the Roman general. I must speak with him immediately. No one sees Caesar without authorization. State your name and business, and I will determine if your message warrants disturbing him. My name is of no importance, but my message is for Caesar alone. It concerns the Queen of Egypt and a plot against his life."
That got their attention. The mention of a plot against Caesar's life made several of the guards exchange glances. They could not dismiss such a claim out of hand, but neither could they simply let an unknown woman through their security cordon. "If you have information about a plot," the centurion said, "you can report it to me. I will convey it to Caesar." "No," I said firmly, "this information is for Caesar's ears only, and it must be delivered now before it is too late. Every moment we waste talking here is a moment lost." The centurion was clearly torn. He was a professional soldier, trained to follow protocols and maintain security, but he was also intelligent enough to know that if there was a genuine plot against Caesar and he delayed the warning because of protocol, he would bear the responsibility for whatever happened. "Wait here," he finally said. He turned to one of his men. "Watch her. If she moves, kill her." He disappeared through the double doors into Caesar's apartments. I stood perfectly still, acutely aware of the guards' weapons trained on me, of my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. This was the moment of greatest danger. If the centurion returned and simply dragged me away for questioning, if he decided I was not important enough to disturb Caesar, my plan would fail before it truly began. But I had gambled correctly on the centurion's sense of responsibility. When he returned, he looked frustrated but resigned. "Caesar will see you.
but you will be searched first, and if you make any threatening move, you will be killed instantly." Female guards were summoned from somewhere deeper in the palace, and I was thoroughly searched. They found nothing because I carried nothing. No weapons, no concealed items, nothing but the clothes I wore and the small carved wooden fish Nicanor had given me, which they examined suspiciously before returning to me. Finally, I was escorted through the double doors and into my father's old apartments. The rooms had been redecorated since I had last seen them, made more Roman in style, but the basic layout was the same. We passed through an antechamber, then another room, and finally into the private study where my father had once conducted his business. Julius Caesar sat behind a large desk covered with maps and documents, a oil lamp illuminating his work. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 50 years old, with a lean, athletic build and features that must have been handsome in his youth and still retained a certain compelling quality. His hair was thin on top, which I had heard vexed him greatly, and he wore it combed forward in the Roman style. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, the eyes of a man who saw everything and forgot nothing. He looked up as I entered, and I saw him assess me in a single glance: my common clothes, my weathered appearance, my apparent status as a person of no importance. Then he gestured to the guards. "Leave us," he said in Greek, his accent revealing his Roman origins, but his vocabulary perfect. "Wait outside. This woman is no threat to me." The guards hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with leaving Caesar alone with an unknown visitor, but they obeyed. The centurion was the last to leave, giving me a warning look that promised swift retribution if I tried anything. Caesar laughed, a genuine sound of delight. "You are either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish, possibly both. Tell me, how did you even get into the palace? Achillas assured me his security was impenetrable." "I walked in," I said simply, "disguised as a merchant's wife. Your guards stopped me outside, which is how I gained this audience. As for Achillas's security, it is designed to keep armies out, not determined individuals in. He is a military man, and he thinks in terms of military solutions. He forgot that sometimes the greatest threats come not from without, but from within." "Interesting," Caesar murmured, returning to his chair and gesturing for me to sit in the chair opposite his desk. "You have certainly demonstrated resourcefulness, but resourcefulness alone does not make a queen. What makes you think you are better suited to rule Egypt than your brother?" I sat, grateful for the chance to take the weight off my trembling legs, though I kept my posture straight and regal. "My brother is 13 years old and completely under the control of his advisors. He signs what they tell him to sign, says what they tell him to say, believes what they tell him to believe. He is not a ruler, he is a puppet. Egypt deserves better than to be governed by men who are not even of royal blood, who have no legitimacy beyond what they have seized through manipulation." "And you?" Caesar prompted. "What makes you different?" "I am of age. I am educated. I speak 9 languages. I have studied history and philosophy and mathematics. I understand governance and diplomacy. I know Egypt's history, its customs, its people. I am willing to work with Rome rather than scheme against it. And most importantly, I am willing to fight for my throne. I have proven that by surviving these past weeks, by evading capture, by standing here before you now." Caesar was silent for a moment, studying me with those penetrating eyes. I could see him calculating, weighing options, considering angles. This was a man who thought several moves ahead in any situation. "You say you are willing to work with Rome," he said finally. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means I recognize the reality of power in the Mediterranean. Rome is the dominant force, and Egypt cannot stand alone against Roman might. My father understood this, which is why he cultivated relationships with Roman leaders, why he borrowed money from Roman lenders, why he worked to maintain Egypt's independence through cooperation rather than confrontation. I will continue that policy. Egypt will honor its commitments to Rome, will continue to supply grain, will be a reliable ally rather than a troublesome problem." "That is what Pothinus promises me as well," Caesar pointed out. "He has been very accommodating, very eager to please. Why should I trust you over him?" "Because Pothinus does not have the authority to make those promises. He is a eunuch advisor with no legitimate claim to power. Any agreements you make with him can be contested, can be overturned, can become sources of future conflict. But I am the rightful queen. Agreements made with me have the force of legitimate sovereignty behind them. They are stable, reliable, enduring. And there is another reason," I continued, leaning forward slightly. "Pothinus and Achillas are afraid of Rome. They accommodate you out of fear, and they resent that accommodation. Men who act out of fear and resentment are unreliable allies. They will turn on you the moment they think they can get away with it. I, on the other hand, see Rome not as a threat, but as an opportunity. I see the possibility of a genuine partnership between Egypt and Rome, based on mutual benefit rather than coercion." Caesar's eyes glinted with interest. "You are remarkably articulate for someone so young. How old are you?" 21. Old enough to rule, young enough to rule for many years to come. Unlike my brother, who, even when he comes of age, will be forever marked by his current subordination to his advisors." "True," Caesar mused. He rose from his chair again and walked to the window, looking out over Alexandria. "I will be honest with you, Cleopatra. Your situation appeals to me. I do find your boldness impressive, and you make valid points about legitimacy and stability. But there are practical problems. Achillas controls an army of 20,000 men. I have perhaps 4,000 here in Alexandria. If I declare support for you, I could find myself in the middle of a civil war, trapped in a foreign city with limited forces. Achillas's army is not as strong as it appears. Most of those soldiers are conscripts and mercenaries with no particular loyalty to Pothinus or my brother. They fight because they are paid, not because they believe in the cause. If you support me, if you declare me the legitimate ruler, many of those soldiers will simply switch sides. Egyptians respect power and legitimacy, and I have legitimacy where Pothinus has none." "Perhaps," Caesar said, "but you have no army at all at the moment. You fled with what, a dozen supporters? Even if I declare for you, how do you propose to actually take control of Egypt?" This was the crucial moment, the point where I had to convince him that I was not just brave and intelligent, but also practical and strategic.
I do not need to conquer Egypt. I need only to hold Alexandria until the rest of the country declares for me. And I can do that with your help. Your 4,000 legionaries are worth more than Achillas's 20,000 conscripts. Roman discipline and training are legendary. If we move quickly, if we secure the key points in Alexandria before Achillas can react, we can control the city. Once we control Alexandria, we control Egypt's trade, its grain exports, its access to the sea. The rest of the country will fall in line because they have no choice.
You make it sound simple, Caesar observed. But these things are never simple. There will be fighting, bloodshed, complications. My men could be trapped here for months. Or, I said quietly, you could avoid all of that by supporting Pothinus and my brother. It would certainly be simpler in the short term, but it would also be a mistake, because Pothinus cannot provide the stability you need. Within a year, there will be revolts, power struggles, possibly a complete collapse of order. You will end up having to return to Egypt with a much larger force to clean up the mess. Supporting me now, while it is more difficult, will save you far more trouble in the long run. Caesar turned from the window to face me, and I saw respect in his eyes along with the calculation. You argue your case well. You remind me of myself at your age, ambitious, bold, willing to take enormous risks for enormous rewards. But I need time to think about this, to consider all the implications. With respect, General, I said, you do not have time. Pothinus and Achillas are planning to move against you. I heard rumors of this even before I fled Alexandria. They intend to trap you in the palace, to cut off your supplies and communications, to force you to accept their terms or face destruction. They are merely waiting for the right moment. Caesar's expression hardened. You have evidence of this? Nothing I could present in a court, I admitted, but I know these men. I have watched them operate for years. They see you as a problem to be managed, not as an ally to be respected. And the moment they think they can eliminate you without obvious Egyptian involvement, they will do so. There was a long silence. I could see Caesar turning over everything I had said, weighing risks and benefits, considering angles and outcomes. This was a man who had made countless crucial decisions in his life, who had gambled his fortune and his life many times. He understood risk. He understood reward. The question was whether he understood me, whether he believed I could deliver on my promises. Finally, he spoke. If I support you, if I declare you the legitimate queen of Egypt, will you swear an oath to honor all of Egypt's commitments to Rome? Will you guarantee the grain shipments, the trading rights, the access to Egyptian ports and resources? I swear it, I said immediately. By all the gods of Egypt and Greece and Rome, I swear that Egypt will be a loyal and reliable ally to the Roman Republic. And you will acknowledge Roman authority in matters of international policy. I hesitated only a moment before answering. This was the price of Roman support, a degree of subordination to Roman interests. My father had paid this price, and now I would pay it too. But there were worse prices than acknowledging political realities. I will acknowledge that Egypt's interests and Rome's interests are intertwined. I will consult with Rome on major policy decisions. I will not act contrary to Roman interests without cause. But I must maintain some degree of sovereignty, some independence of action, or I become nothing more than a Roman governor in Egyptian clothing. That serves neither of us well. Caesar smiled slightly, appreciating the diplomatic phrasing that gave him what he needed while preserving my dignity. You argue your case well. You remind me of myself at your age. Ambitious, bold, willing to take enormous risks for enormous rewards. But I need time to think about this, to consider all the implications. Relief flooded through me so powerfully I almost gasped. I had done it.
I had gained Caesar's support. I was no longer a fugitive with no hope. I was a queen with the backing of Rome's greatest general. But there was no time to celebrate. Caesar was already moving, his mind already working on the tactical problems. "Here is what we will do," he said, returning to his desk and pulling out a map of Alexandria. "Tomorrow, I will summon both you and your brother to a formal audience to present your cases before me. This will force Pothinus and Achillas to commit to their positions publicly. It will also give me an excuse to bring more of my soldiers into the palace complex for security. Once we have sufficient forces in place, we can secure the key buildings and prevent Achillas from moving his army into position." "But Pothinus knows I am in the city now. Your guards saw me arrive. Word will spread." "Not necessarily," Caesar said with a slight smile. "My guards are Roman legionaries. They follow orders, and I will order them to speak to no one about your presence here. As far as anyone outside this room knows, I received a visit from a merchant's wife with rumors about a plot. Nothing more. You will remain here, in these apartments, under my protection. Tomorrow, when I summon you and your brother, it will seem as though you just arrived, that you responded to my summons from wherever you were hiding." It was brilliant. By keeping my presence secret until the formal audience, Caesar maintained the element of surprise while giving himself time to position his forces. Pothinus and Achillas would have no time to prepare a countermove. "What about my companions?" I asked. "I did not come here alone. There are people who helped me, who risked their lives for me. I cannot abandon them." "Give me their names and descriptions," Caesar said. "I will have my men find them and bring them here safely. Anyone who was loyal enough to follow you through your exile deserves protection." I gave him information about Apollodorus and Charmion, and Caesar immediately dispatched trusted soldiers to find them and bring them to the palace. Within an hour, both of them were escorted into the apartments, looking amazed and relieved to find me safe and in apparent favor with Caesar.
That night, I slept in my father's old bedroom, in the bed where he had slept, surrounded by Roman guards instead of Egyptian ones. It was surreal, dreamlike, as if I had stepped out of one reality and into another. Just days ago, I had been sleeping on a pallet in a fisherman's house. Now I was back in the palace, preparing to reclaim my throne. But I knew the real struggle was just beginning. Tomorrow's audience with Caesar would be the first open confrontation with Pothinus and my brother. It would be the moment when everything came into the light, when hidden conflicts became open warfare. And while I had Caesar's support, that did not guarantee victory. There were still so many things that could go wrong, so many ways this could all collapse into disaster. I lay awake for hours, thinking and planning, going over every possible scenario, every potential complication. Through the window, I could see the beam from the lighthouse sweeping across the harbor, that eternal guardian keeping watch over Alexandria. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Achilles' army was camped, waiting for orders that would determine the fate of Egypt. Somewhere in the palace, Pothinus was sleeping, confident in his power, unaware that everything was about to change. And somewhere in my heart, beneath the fear and the calculation and the strategic thinking, I felt something else. Hope. Real, genuine hope that I might actually succeed, that I might reclaim my throne and become the queen I was meant to be. It was a dangerous feeling, hope. It made you vulnerable, made you care about outcomes, made failure hurt more keenly. But it was also what made everything worthwhile. Tomorrow, I would face my enemies in Caesar's presence. Tomorrow, the struggle for Egypt would enter a new phase. Tomorrow, I would learn whether my gamble had truly paid off or whether I had merely postponed my inevitable defeat. But tonight, for the first time since fleeing Alexandria, I slept in safety, protected by Roman guards, my future uncertain, but no longer hopeless. The game was far from over. In fact,
it was only just beginning. Dawn came to Alexandria as it always did, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, the light reflecting off the harbor waters and turning them into liquid fire. I stood at the window of my father's apartments, watching the city wake, and I felt a strange calm settle over me. Today would decide everything. Today I would either reclaim my birthright or lose everything forever. There was no middle ground, no compromise, no possibility of retreat. Charmion came to help me prepare, and together we made choices that I knew would matter far more than they might seem. I could not appear before Caesar and my brother dressed as a common merchant's wife, but neither could I appear in the full regalia of Egyptian royalty. That would seem presumptuous, as if I were declaring victory before the battle had even begun. Instead, we chose a middle path, a gown of white linen, finely made but not ostentatiously royal, with a gold belt at my waist and simple gold jewelry at my throat and wrists. My hair was cleaned of the dye we had used, restored to its natural black, and arranged in the Greek style with a simple gold band to hold it in place. When I looked at myself in the polished bronze mirror, I saw someone who looked both young and ancient, both vulnerable and powerful. I saw a woman who had been stripped of everything and somehow survived to fight another day. I saw a queen, not by title alone, but by earned right. Caesar had arranged for the audience to take place in the great throne room of the palace, that magnificent chamber where the Ptolemies had received ambassadors and petitioners for nearly 3 centuries. It was a room designed to awe and intimidate, with soaring columns painted in vibrant colors, walls covered with hieroglyphics and Greek inscriptions, and a ceiling painted to resemble the night sky with silver stars against deep blue. At the far end of the room stood the double throne of Egypt, where pharaohs had sat with their consorts since time immemorial. Caesar had positioned himself not on the throne, that would have been too presumptuous even for him, but on a raised dais before it, sitting in a chair that was clearly Roman in style, making the statement that he was there as a mediator, a representative of Roman authority, not as a claimant to Egyptian power. His soldiers lined the walls of the throne room, perhaps 200 of them, a clear show of force that made everyone understand who truly held power in this moment. I was escorted into the throne room by Roman guards, and I felt every eye in the chamber turned to me. The room was filled with courtiers and officials, priests and administrators, military officers and foreign ambassadors, all the machinery of government that made Egypt function. Many of these people had served under my father, had known me since childhood. I saw recognition in their eyes, saw surprise and confusion, and in some cases, something that might have been hope. But the faces that mattered most were at the front of the room. My brother Ptolemy stood near Caesar's dais, dressed in the full regalia of Pharaoh, with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt on his head and the ceremonial false beard attached to his chin. He looked like a child playing dress-up, which was essentially what he was. At 13, he had not yet lost the soft features of boyhood, and the magnificent royal costume only emphasized how small and young he was.
Beside him stood Pothinus, and when our eyes met, I saw naked hatred in his gaze. He was a tall man, made taller by the elaborate headdress he wore as chief advisor. His face was smooth and hairless, as was common for eunuchs, and his body had the soft, undefined quality of someone who had never developed fully as a man. But there was nothing soft about his eyes or his mind. He had orchestrated my exile, had tried to have me killed, and now I had returned to threaten everything he had built. Achillas was there too, dressed in military regalia, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. He was a blunt instrument compared to Pothinus's subtle knife, but no less dangerous for that. His scarred face showed no emotion as he watched me approach, but I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He was wondering how I had gotten into the palace, how many supporters I had, whether I represented a real threat or merely a nuisance to be eliminated. I walked the length of that throne room with my head held high, my steps measured and deliberate, playing the role I had been born to play. I was Cleopatra, daughter of the Ptolemies, heir to Alexander's legacy, queen of Egypt by right and by blood. And I had come home. When I reached the dais, I did not bow or kneel. Instead, I inclined my head respectfully to Caesar, acknowledging his authority as mediator while not subordinating myself, and then turned to face my brother. "Ptolemy," I said, using his name rather than his title. "It has been too long since we spoke as family rather than as enemies. I am glad we have this opportunity to resolve our differences in a civilized manner." The boy looked confused, glancing at Pothinus for guidance. The advisor's face had gone pale with barely suppressed rage, but he could not intervene openly without undermining the fiction that Ptolemy was the true ruler. Caesar rose from his chair, his voice carrying through the throne room with the practiced projection of someone accustomed to addressing troops in the chaos of battle. "We are gathered here today to resolve the question of Egypt's rightful ruler. Both Cleopatra and Ptolemy claim the throne. Both assert legitimacy under the terms of their father's will. As a representative of the Roman Republic, and as someone with a vested interest in Egypt's stability, I have agreed to hear both cases and render a judgment." He gestured to Pothinus. "You may present your case first. Tell me why Ptolemy should rule Egypt alone without his sister." Pothinus stepped forward, and I had to admit he was a skilled orator. He spoke eloquently about how Cleopatra had violated the terms of the co-regency, how she had made decisions without consulting the council, how she had corresponded with Rome independently, how she had shown contempt for Egyptian traditions and customs. He painted a picture of me as an ambitious, reckless young woman who cared more about personal power than about Egypt's welfare. "She fled rather than face justice," Pothinus concluded. "She abandoned her responsibilities and her people. Such behavior demonstrates unfitness for rule. Egypt needs stable, traditional leadership, not the whims of an impulsive girl who thinks herself above the laws that govern us all." When he finished, there was a murmur of approval from some in the audience, those who were loyal to Pothinus or who genuinely believed his version of events. But I noticed that many others remained silent, waiting to hear my response. Caesar turned to me. "You may now present your case, Cleopatra. Defend yourself against these charges." I took a breath and stepped forward, looking not at Caesar but at the assembled courtiers and officials, the people who actually ran Egypt day to day. "Pothinus speaks of tradition and law," I began, my voice clear and steady. "But what tradition is it that allows a eunuch advisor to wield more power than the pharaoh himself? What law gives a regency council the authority to override the explicit will of a departed king? My father, Ptolemy XII, named both myself and my brother as co-regents. He did not name Pothinus. He did not name Achillas. He named his children to rule together as equals." I turned to face my brother directly. "Ptolemy, do you even remember our father? Do you remember what he told us about our duties to Egypt, about the responsibility we would bear? Or have these men filled your head with so many lies and manipulations that you have forgotten who you are and what you were meant to become?" The boy's face showed confusion and something that might have been pain. For a moment, I saw past the puppet to the frightened child beneath, and I felt a surge of pity for him. He was as much a victim of Pothinus as I was, just trapped in a different kind of cage. "I did not flee to avoid justice," I continued, addressing the room at large again. "I fled to avoid murder. Achillas was ordered to arrest me, but the orders he received gave him permission to kill me if I resisted. That is not justice. That is execution dressed up in legal language. I fled because I wanted to live, because I believed that Egypt deserved better than to be ruled by advisors who governed through fear and assassination." I could see people listening now, really listening.
These were intelligent men and women who had watched Pothinus consolidate power over the past 3 years. Many of them had chafed under his rule, but had lacked the courage or the means to oppose him. Now I was giving voice to their unspoken concerns. As for my actions while in power, yes, I made decisions independently. Someone had to actually govern Egypt while my brother played with his toys and Pothinus played at being pharaoh. I corresponded with Rome because maintaining those relationships is essential to Egypt's survival. I made appointments and issued orders because that is what rulers do. They rule. If that makes me unfit for the throne, then every pharaoh in Egypt's history was unfit because they all exercised the power that was rightfully theirs.
I turned back to Caesar now, meeting his eyes directly. General Caesar, you are a man who understands power and legitimacy. You crossed the Rubicon rather than submit to unjust authority. You fought a civil war to defend your rights and your dignity. Can you honestly tell me you would have acted differently in my position? Would you have meekly submitted to arrest by men who had no authority to give such orders? Would you have let yourself be removed from power by advisors and generals who had no legitimate claim to rule? Caesar's eyes glinted with what might have been amusement or respect. You make a compelling case, but tell me this, Cleopatra. If I restore you to the throne, what guarantees do I have that Egypt will remain stable? Your brother's faction controls the army. There are many who support their claim. How do you propose to rule when half the kingdom opposes you? This was the crucial moment, the question I had been preparing for. I do not propose to rule alone, I said clearly. My father's will called for co-regency, and I honor that wish. I am willing to share power with my brother, as was originally intended. But I will not share power with Pothinus and Achillas. They must be removed from their positions, and genuine advisors who serve Egypt rather than their own ambitions must replace them. I saw Pothinus' face go rigid with fury, but before he could speak, I continued. As for the army, I believe you will find that most soldiers are loyal to Egypt and to legitimate authority, not to corrupt advisors. Once it is clear that I have Rome's backing and that I am willing to work within the framework of my father's will, I believe most of the army will accept the new arrangement. Those who do not can be dealt with, not through violence, if it can be avoided, but through removal from positions of authority. And what of Rome's interests? Caesar asked. How do I know you will honor Egypt's commitments? Because our interests align, I said simply. Egypt needs Roman protection and access to Roman markets. Rome needs Egypt's grain and Egypt's wealth. I am intelligent enough to see that opposing Rome serves neither Egypt nor myself. I will be a loyal ally, not because I am compelled to be, but because I choose to be. And chosen loyalty is always more reliable than forced submission. Caesar nodded slowly, and I could see that I had convinced him, not just intellectually, but in some deeper way. He recognized in me something of himself, that combination of ambition and intelligence and willingness to take enormous risks. He saw someone he could work with, someone who understood the game and played it well. I have heard enough, Caesar declared, his voice ringing through the throne room. It is clear to me that both Cleopatra and Ptolemy have legitimate claims under their father's will. It is also clear that the current arrangement, with Ptolemy under the control of his advisors, is neither stable nor in Rome's interests. Therefore, I decree the following. Cleopatra and Ptolemy will rule as co-regents, as originally intended by Ptolemy XIII. They will share power equally, making major decisions jointly. The Regency Council is hereby dissolved. Pothinus and Achillas are removed from their positions effective immediately. The throne room erupted in noise. Gasps, shouts, protests from Pothinus' supporters, cheers from those who had been waiting for someone to challenge the corrupt council. I stood perfectly still, letting the reality of Caesar's words sink in. I had won. Against all odds, against every reasonable expectation, I had reclaimed my throne. But Pothinus was not done.
"This is an outrage," he shouted over the tumult. "Rome has no authority to dictate Egypt's internal governance. You overstep your bounds, Caesar." Caesar's expression turned cold and hard, revealing the ruthless general beneath the diplomatic facade. "I overstep nothing. Egypt is a client state of Rome, dependent on Roman grain imports and Roman protection. The Senate has given me imperium over the eastern provinces. I have every authority to ensure stability in this region. If you wish to challenge my decree, you are welcome to raise the matter with the Senate in Rome. I am sure they will be fascinated to hear about the corrupt eunuch who tried to dictate terms to a Roman general." The threat was clear and unmistakable. Pothinus could accept Caesar's judgment, or he could be destroyed, utterly and completely. For a long moment he stood there, his face twisted with rage and impotence, and I saw the moment when he made his choice. He would accept defeat publicly, maintain a facade of compliance, and then work behind the scenes to reverse his fortunes. It was what I would have done in his position. "Of course," Pothinus said, his voice dripping with false humility, "I bow to the wisdom of Rome. If this is what the general believes best serves Egypt's interests, then I accept his judgment." "You misunderstand," Caesar said coldly. "I did not ask for your acceptance. I stated a fact. You have been removed from power. You will leave the palace today, and you will retire to private life. If you attempt to interfere in Egypt's governance, you will be arrested and tried for treason. Is that clear?" Pothinus's face went white, but he nodded stiffly. Beside him, Achillas' hand tightened on his sword, but he was intelligent enough to know that challenging 200 Roman legionaries would be suicide. For now, they had no choice but to accept their defeat. Caesar turned to my brother, who looked lost and confused by everything that had happened. "Ptolemy, do you accept this arrangement? Will you rule jointly with your sister as your father intended?" The boy looked at Pothinus, then at me, then back at Caesar. I could see the struggle happening behind his eyes. Years of conditioning by Pothinus, warring with his own intelligence, and perhaps some deeply buried memory of what our father actually wanted. "I accept," he said finally, his voice small but clear. "I will rule with my sister."
And just like that, it was over. The formal ceremony took another hour, documents to be signed, oaths to be sworn, pronouncements to be made. But the essential drama had concluded. I was Queen of Egypt again, ruling jointly with my brother, with Caesar's backing and the machinery of government at my disposal. As the crowd dispersed and the throne room slowly emptied, I found myself standing before the double throne where the pharaohs of Egypt had sat for millennia. I reached out and touched the cool stone, feeling the weight of history in that simple gesture. My father had sat here, his father before him, all the way back through the Ptolemies to Alexander himself, and before him to the ancient pharaohs of the dynasties, stretching back into the mists of time. I had reclaimed this throne not through inheritance alone, but through intelligence and courage and a willingness to risk everything. I had lost everything and found out what I was truly made of. I had been stripped of my crown and discovered that a queen is not defined by what she wears, but by what she carries inside her. Apollodorus approached me, grinning broadly. "Well, my queen, it seems your audacious plan actually worked. Against all odds and all reasonable expectations, you did it." "We did it," I corrected him. "I could never have survived without you, without Charmion, without Diomedes and all the others who risked everything to help me. This victory belongs to all of us." Charmion came to stand beside me, and I saw tears in her amber eyes. "You were magnificent," she said softly. "Your father would have been so proud." I felt my own eyes sting with tears then, thinking of my father and how he had struggled to maintain Egypt's independence in an age of Roman dominance. I had done what he could not. I had secured real partnership with Rome, had gained the backing of Rome's most powerful general, had positioned Egypt to survive and perhaps even thrive in the new world that was emerging. But I also knew that this was only the beginning. Pothinus and Achilles had accepted defeat publicly, but they would work in secret to undermine me. My brother was still young and impressionable, and there would be those who would try to turn him against me again. The political situation in Rome was unstable, with civil war still raging, and Caesar's power, though great, was not absolute. There were 1,000 ways this could still go wrong. And yet, standing there in that throne room, touching the ancient stone of the pharaoh's throne, I felt not fear, but anticipation. I had learned something crucial during my weeks as a fugitive. I was strong enough to face whatever came. I was intelligent enough to outthink my enemies. I was brave enough to take enormous risks when necessary, and I was determined enough to never give up, no matter how dire the circumstances appeared. Over the following days, I began the work of actually governing Egypt. Caesar remained in Alexandria, his presence a guarantee of my security, and we spent long hours in discussion, mapping out the future of Egypt's relationship with Rome. I found him to be a fascinating companion, brilliant, cynical, ambitious, and yet also capable of surprising kindness and humor. There was an attraction there, undeniable and mutual, though neither of us acted on it immediately. We were both too intelligent to confuse political alliance with personal connection, though we both knew that the line between the two was not as clear as it might seem. I also began the delicate process of reconciliation with my brother. Ptolemy was weary of me at first, still influenced by years of Pothinus's poison. But slowly, carefully, I began to rebuild the relationship we had once had as children, before politics and ambition had torn us apart. I told him stories of our father, reminded him of what our family had been, showed him that I was not his enemy, but his sister. It was slow work, and I was not sure it would ever fully succeed, but I had to try. The Egyptian people, I discovered, were surprisingly supportive of my return. They had never really accepted Pothinus and Achilles, seeing them as foreign intruders into the sacred institution of pharaonic rule. My dramatic return, my bold confrontation with the Regency Council, my alliance with Rome, all of these things fit the Egyptian love of grand gestures and dramatic narratives. I was becoming not just a ruler, but a legend, and I used that carefully, cultivating an image of the pharaoh queen who had been tested by adversity and emerged stronger. 3 weeks after my restoration, I stood on the balcony of the palace and watched the sun set over Alexandria. The city spread out before me in all its magnificence. The lighthouse sending its beam across the harbor, the library standing like a temple to knowledge, the theater where Greek dramas were performed, the marketplaces where goods from across the known world changed hands. My city, my kingdom, my responsibility. Charmion joined me on the balcony, carrying wine in 2 cups. We drank in comfortable silence, watching the colors change in the western sky. "Do you ever think about those nights in Anthilla?" I asked her, sleeping on reed pallets in a fisherman's house, hiding from Achilles soldiers? "Every day," she admitted. "In some ways, life was simpler then. The path was clear. Survive, reach Caesar, reclaim the throne. Now the path is much more complicated." "Yes," I agreed. "Now we have to actually rule, to make decisions that affect millions of people, to navigate between Egypt's interests and Rome's demands, to maintain power in a world where power is always contested." "Are you sorry?" Charmion asked. "Do you wish you had stayed in exile, lived a simple life somewhere far from all this?" I considered the question seriously before answering. "No," I said finally. "This is what I was born for. This is who I am.
Not because of my bloodline, but because of who I discovered myself to be when everything else was stripped away. I am a queen, Charmion. Not by title alone, but by nature. This is where I belong.
And it was true. The woman standing on that balcony was not the same person who had fled Alexandria in the dead of night. That flight, that exile, that desperate struggle for survival, it had all been necessary. It had burned away the superficial aspects of my identity and revealed what was essential. It had taught me that power without legitimacy is hollow, but legitimacy without courage is worthless. It had shown me that true strength comes not from never falling, but from getting back up when you do fall. In the months and years that followed, there would be more struggles, more challenges, more moments when everything seemed to hang by a thread. There would be war with Pothinus and Achillas, who could not accept their defeat and raised a rebellion that nearly succeeded. There would be the deepening relationship with Caesar, which became both political alliance and genuine love affair, resulting in a son who would carry both Roman and Egyptian blood. There would be Caesar's assassination and the chaos that followed, the civil wars that tore the Roman world apart, my alliance with Mark Antony, and eventually the final confrontation with Octavian that would end the Ptolemaic dynasty forever. But all of that was still in the future, invisible and unknown. On that evening, standing on the palace balcony with Charmion beside me and the city spread out below, I felt only gratitude for what I had survived and hope for what was yet to come. I had fled Alexandria as a frightened young woman with a crown she had not earned. I had returned as a queen who understood what that title truly meant. I had lost everything and found myself. I had been defeated and discovered that defeat is not the end, but merely another beginning. The lighthouse beam swept across the harbor, that eternal guardian keeping watch over the city. And I stood there, watching it, knowing that I too would keep watch, would guard Egypt's interests, would fight for my people and my kingdom as long as breath remained in my body. This was my rebirth. This was my transformation. This was the moment when Cleopatra, daughter of the Ptolemies, truly became Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. And the story, though it seemed to have ended, was really just beginning.